Reality is comprised of self-generative organismic systems, living complexes which achieve unity through the hierarchical organization of a diversity of more elementary constituents. To borrow a term from the philosopher Arthur Koestler, we can refer to such organic complexes as holons. This is a term which we could use to refer to biological organisms, molecular crystals, star systems, civilizations, or even ideologies or religious doctrines. Self-generation, or autopoiesis, is the fundamental principle of animacy, and holons are the consequent offspring of such creative power. Here I want us to begin looking at the basic morphological dynamics of such animacy. We can begin by looking at the diversity of elements which might come to constitute a holon. Systems which are comprised of a small number of distinct elements are more homogeneous, while those with a greater diversity of constituents are more heterogeneous. An ant colony, for example, is in many ways much more homogeneous than a city comprised of human beings. The ants are, for the most part, effectively clones of one another, with differences between individual ants being strictly conditioned by the needs of the colony for specialization. The human beings which comprise a city, however, exhibit far more individual distinctiveness, diversity, and thus heterogeneity. We can visually imagine this distinction between homogeneity and heterogeneity as a polarity of narrowness and width. Next, we can begin to look at differences in the ecological order which is exhibited by such holons. When the diversity of constituent elements is synthesized by a higher organizational principle, this manifests as consonance or order. Dissonance arises when there is a lack of such an encompassing order. When certain subsidiary elements of the system are not integrated into a more general structure, conflict arises between these elements, thus creating a friction which will inevitably attempt to resolve itself through either metamorphosis or disintegration. Again, we find a continuous spectral polarity between consonance and dissonance, as a diversity of elements can be organized in various ways, with varying degrees of friction or synergy exhibited by the complexes which they come to form. A complex which is highly consonant yet highly homogeneous is one which we could say is lacking in organizational depth, and consequently much more experientially shallow. That is, the structure of animacy, which is the holon, is characterized by much less intensity of awareness. The ant colony, for example, exhibits far less depth of awareness than a human being. Despite being highly consonant, the shallowness of such holons can itself be a kind of tension, a vacuum which nature notoriously abhors. Even homogeneous systems consist of elements which are capable of acting independently, and unless the overarching structure of the holon actively ensures the constriction of this freedom, then dissonance will inevitably arise, thereby ultimately generating the spontaneous emergence of new forms of order. The second law of thermodynamics, which indicates that systems inevitably become more entropic over time, is thus only applicable to inert or mechanistic systems which are unable to achieve higher levels of organization spontaneously. Such systems gravitate towards thermodynamic equilibrium because homogeneity is the only form of consonance which is available to them. For truly organic processes which are capable of autopoiesis or self-generation, this is never exclusively the case. Nature gravitates towards the realization of holons which exhibit both width and consonance. That is, towards the realization of organismic complexes which are both constituted by a diversity of elements and the integration of that diversity into hierarchies of organizational principles which synergize differences into unities. The one becomes many, and the many then become unity. Nature, in other words, is teleologically oriented by its most basic formative principles unto the achievement of eurythmia, of musicality. Musicality is something which we most commonly associate with sound, but in truth the morphological dynamics we find within music are in fact the most basic morphological dynamics of nature itself. Reality is self-compositional in the most literal sense. Music strives towards the achievement of depth, towards the achievement of unity from diversity, and thus the generation of experiential intensity. Within our cosmos, the greatest possibility of such deepening of feeling is represented by human consciousness, and the possibility of human theosis. The human sense of egoic existence represents the ultimate separation and differentiation from reality. It is the experience of division between interiority and exteriority, and thus represents the greatest potential for the alienation of individual consciousness from the consciousness of the cosmos as a whole. Nonetheless, this separation and interiority of human consciousness is also individuation. It is the condition for the possibility of true self-agency, creative freedom, and the most absolute affirmation of life through the powers of empathic resonance and self-sacrifice. The ultimate possibility of conscious experience, then, is that of numinosity, within which the boundaries between selfhood and alterity come to be transmuted into an experience of ultimate meaning and solidarity. This transcendence is the exact same syzygy of consonance and dissonance which we find within the morphogenetics of musicality, because the fundamental principle of being itself is musicality. As such, we should find that the principles of tonality and modality, consonance and dissonance, ascension and descension are universal principles of all formative powers which we might disclose through the various ontological layers of nature. Unfortunately, modern music education has come to be poisoned by the dissolutive, anti-realist relativism, which is emblematic of deficient perspectival consciousness, and which we see throughout many fields of contemporary science, philosophy, and art. If one begins to ask questions such as, why do we use 12-note tuning systems? Or why do most scales have 7 notes? Or why do major and minor intervals evoke distinct emotional responses? Then you are very likely to encounter a slew of dismissive non-answers which effectively explain away musical morphology as a whole in terms of arbitrary cultural differences. Of course, it is true that there are often dramatic differences in musical practices across distinct culture forms and cultural eras. Nonetheless, the non-answers provided by contemporary musical education implicitly indicate that such cultural differences are purely arbitrary, that we only experience major and minor as having distinct emotional tones due to arbitrary cultural conditioning, or that Bach or Beethoven might very well have composed their symphonies using 20 notes instead of 12 if the random dice rolls of historical contingency had played out differently. Of course, the field of musicology is absolutely massive, and so I'm not going to be able to compare and contrast a wide variety of different musical traditions from distinct cultures in this video. But what I do want to do here is begin to illustrate why the Western musical tradition has developed in the way that it has, and begin to illustrate the underlying metaphysical implications of Western music. In a number of my previous videos, we have used this diagram, which I've taken to calling the Astrochromagram, as a kind of cipher. I initially developed this diagram in an attempt to use Johann von Goethe's color theory to elucidate the underlying patterns which we find within mythological and astrological archetypes. By continuing to elaborate this framework, I came to see that this primordial form, or phenomenon, to use Goethe's terminology, could also be seen within the myth cycle, or hero's journey, which Joseph Campbell saw to lie within the internal structure of mythical narratives, the very same underlying pattern which Carl Jung described as the individuation process. As we have seen in more detail in previous videos, Johann von Goethe's color theory shows us that all colors arise from the dynamic interpenetration of light and darkness, and what the Astrochromagram illustrates is how we can see this same dynamic interpenetration to be an underlying principle of formative, noetic processes in general. The division into 12 sections is also much more than an arbitrary contrivance. As we shall see, the significance of the number 12 arises naturally from the interplay of triadic and quadratic principles. In this video, I'm going to attempt to illustrate the manner in which these same basic principles are also at work in the phenomenology of music. In order to do so, we need to first look at the most general morphological features of tonal harmony, otherwise known as solar harmony, and in doing so, begin to explicate the intimate relationship between musical practices and the underlying metaphysical characteristics of human life worlds. The modern 12-tone division of the octave originates from the Pythagorean tradition. The Pythagoreans found that by following a series of perfect fifths or perfect fourths, one would arrive at almost exactly the note one started from after 12 steps. That almost above is something that needs to be emphasized. This is the infamous Pythagorean comma, which is the small but significant and inextricable gap which arises when one follows the cycle of fifths in this manner. We almost arrive back at our starting point, but slightly overshoot the mark. This is not a failure which arises due to the technical limitations of physical instruments, but rather a kind of asymmetry which resides within the very mathematical structure of musicality itself. The ancient Greeks saw this apparent imperfection as indicative of the inherently flawed nature of the world. The Greeks, like all classical Indo-European cultures, saw the terrestrial world as an inherently flawed approximation of the celestial realm, which was characterized by perfection, purity, and timelessness. The problem with the Pythagorean comma, however, is that it is not a flaw in the natural terrestrial realm. It is a flaw, so it would seem, within the formative, celestial features of musicality itself. For the Greeks, this was almost unthinkable. It would be almost as though one proved that equilateral triangles have an extra 181st degree, which is somehow necessitated by mathematics, an imperfection which is somehow inherent within the very possibility of music. We also find this comma within the revolutions of the Earth. The Pythagorean comma lands at about 23.46 cents above the exact unison, almost exactly 1/4 of a semitone. Likewise, there are approximately 365.25 days in the Earth's year. If we follow the circle of fifths for 4 full rotations, we find ourselves 1 semitone above the starting note. And every 4 years, the series of days is shifted up by 1 day, and this is the reason for leap years. What we moderns can begin to see, and which the Pythagoreans could not see, is that the Pythagorean comma is indicative of the intimate entanglement and mutual interdependence of the transcendental and terrestrial realms. What the Pythagorean comma gestures towards is the fact that there is no possibility of an absolutely perfect stasis within harmonic compositionality. There is always what Friedrich Schelling would describe as an irreducible remainder, an inherent and necessary incompleteness, which necessitates the continuity of striving and metamorphosis. The very formal structure of being, in other words, necessitates becoming. This is an insight which was simply unavailable within the metaphysical horizon of the Hellenistic life world, but over the course of the past 2 millennia, the possibility of this insight has gradually disclosed itself through the radical re-territorialization of the relationship between transcendence and immanence, which has unfolded following the advent of Christianity. Before moving forward with our analysis of tonal music, I want to go on a bit of a tangent here for those who are undoubtedly inclined to shrug off the isomorphism of the Pythagorean comma and the Earth's revolutionary comma as no more than a coincidence. If this were but one isolated coincidence, then perhaps one could justify such an attitude, but this is far from the case, and in fact we find many such correlations throughout our solar system. The Moon is a perfect example of how such isomorphisms can be found throughout our solar system. The Moon is 400 times smaller than the Sun, but is exactly 400 times closer to the Earth than the Sun. Because of this so-called coincidence, the Sun and Moon appear to be the same size in the sky, thus allowing for perfect solar eclipses. The Moon takes 27.32 days to orbit the Earth, and the Moon also rotates on its axis over a period of 27.32 days. And thus, from our perspective on the Earth, we perceive the Moon to be locked into its axis rather than rotating. The Moon's revolution period also divides the Earth's year into 12 sections, along with yet another kind of Pythagorean comma. This is why the word month shares an etymological connection with the word moon, and this is yet another example of the underlying compositional significance of the number 12, which will become more obvious later on in this video. Broadening our scope to the solar system as a whole, we find even more examples of such harmonic relationships. The planets Pluto and Neptune exhibit a 3-2 resonance pattern in their orbits, the same pattern as a perfect fifth in music. The spin-orbit relationship of Mercury is also a perfect fifth. If we are supposing the formation of our solar system to have been a meaningless process of random contingencies, then these correlations would seem to be utterly inexplicable coincidences. If, on the other hand, we see that our solar system is itself, in fact, a self-generative, living system which is governed by the same underlying compositional principles we see throughout the rest of nature, then these supposed coincidences can instead be seen as expressions of a more fundamental order of nature as a whole. Continuing to follow the thread of the Pythagorean comma would bring us into the realm of microtonality, which is certainly a fascinating topic, but for now we should maintain our focus on the 12-tone system which flowed out from Pythagorean musicology, as it is here that we can begin to see the intrinsic identity of musical and luminous chromaticism. All forms of music operate through dynamics of inhalation and exhalation, principles which manifest as tension and release, dissonance and consonance, intensification and relaxation. Musical harmony can be understood as fundamentally gravitational in nature. A certain note or chord is indicated to be the root or tonic, and this element then serves as a center of harmonic gravity. This principle of harmonic gravity is most commonly expressed through modal harmony, in which the root note of a specific sequence of notes is indicated to be the center of harmonic gravity through a drone note or pedal point, or through the repetition of descending melodic lines which continually return to the root note. Within tonal music, on the other hand, we have the treatment of a particular chord as the center of harmonic gravity. Within tonal music, a sequence or progression of polyphonic chords is used to define one chord as the tonic. The principles of tonal harmony are particularly significant here, as virtually all of the basic principles of contemporary Western musical practice came about through the historical development of tonal harmony. In order to understand this development, we must return to the Pythagoreans, and to the central role played by the tritone interval within this narrative. That is a tritone interval. As you can no doubt hear for yourself, the tritone is an immensely unstable sound, and understanding the nature of this instability is absolutely crucial for understanding the nature of Western music in general. Many music educators tell us that the polarity of consonance and dissonance is defined by the complexity of musical intervals, that more mathematically complex intervals are those which are more dissonant, while more mathematically simple ratios are felt to be more consonant. The reality, however, is a bit more nuanced. It is certainly true that more complex ratios are experienced as greater tension than simple ratios, but with the tritone interval we see dissonance of an entirely different order. The tritone interval can be defined by a number of different ratios depending upon the tuning system in question, but the dissonance of the tritone is not fundamentally a matter of its mathematical complexity, but rather it is a matter of how the tritone evenly divides the octave in half. This is a minor second interval. It is a highly dissonant interval in terms of mathematical complexity, but nonetheless, we don't experience the same groundlessness within the minor second that we experience within the tritone. The minor second is tense, to be sure, but it isn't the same kind of disoriented tension which we experience within an isolated tritone. The reason for this is that within the minor second interval, our minds are still able to perceive an overarching order which encompasses both of the notes which comprise the interval. In this case, the minor second interval consists of the notes D sharp and E. There are two ways that our minds can interpret this relationship based on which tone we experience as being the center of harmonic gravity. Our minds automatically interpret the most obvious structure of order, which might be implicated by the musical elements we are perceiving. Oftentimes, this means that we tend to perceive the lower of two notes as being the center of harmonic gravity, and this is a tendency which we see exploited in the use of bass drones in modal music. Playing the same note over and over in a lower register reinforces that note as the center of gravity. This is not always the case, however, and the minor second interval is actually an example of this. Here we could interpret the D sharp note as the center of gravity because it is the lower note, but in reality we will tend to perceive the E as the actual center unless we are given some other information which indicates that this is not the case. If I play an E in the bass, we experience this as a kind of confirmation of what our minds were already beginning to perceive behind the interval. We are already experiencing this interval as a skeleton of a major seventh chord, and adding in the remaining notes only reinforces this perception. However, if we add the D sharp as the bass note, something very different occurs. Unless you are accustomed to genres of music which make much more use of dissonant chords and scales, this will seem far more surprising and less natural, because now the harmonic structure which is being implied by this is much more dissonant. What is now being implied must be a chord with a Phrygian or Locrian disposition, which is far less stable than the major seventh chord which initially began to presence itself through the minor second interval. What this illustrates is the manner by which musical elements are able to invoke different forms of harmonic order. A hierarchy of tones is insinuated by the musical intervals, and this underlying order is then disclosed by the imaginative faculties of human consciousness. With this understanding, we can now begin to see the unique significance of the tritone interval. As we saw with the minor second, most musical intervals are not perfectly symmetrical. The notes are not on equal footing, as it were, and our minds are thus able to perceive many different structures of harmonic order that the two notes might be expressions of. It is the imbalance between the two notes which gives us clues, as it were, as to what sorts of underlying order might be indicated by the intervals. The tritone, however, is unique in that it perfectly divides the octave in half. The interval BF, for example, is really no different than the interval FB. We find ourselves unable to disclose a center of harmonic gravity because neither of the two notes can be experienced as privileged in relation to the other. We thus experience the tritone as a kind of unanswered question, and if that question remains unanswered, then the tritone feels not only tense but groundless. The tritone seems to demand a resolution, and meeting this demand tends to mean a motion into a new form of harmonic order, a different chord, in other words. This motion of tritone resolution would thus form the basis of Western solar harmony. Rather than treating a certain note as the center of harmonic gravity, as is the case with modal music, Western harmony would develop a practice of moving through a sequence of distinct modal regions or chords, each with their own center of harmonic gravity. Through the tritone function, a chord progression could then designate a specific chord as being the harmonic center of the progression itself. The notes of a given chord would orbit a given root note in the same way that moons orbit a planet, while the chords themselves would orbit a certain tonic chord in the same way that planets orbit a star. The significance of the tritone function is that it allowed the tonic chord to be clearly designated by the progression. Resolving from the tritone to a given chord would clearly suggest that target chord as a sort of ground which the tritone was falling into. The very mathematical underpinnings of Western music implicated not only the 12-tone division of the octave, but also the eventual development of a higher dimension of harmonic organization within Western musical practices. As this story would continue to unfold, with the development of Romanticism within Western classical music and later the development of jazz harmony, these concepts would become generalized even further so as to allow musical practices to disclose ever more polydimensional forms of harmonic order. Western music tends towards using scales with exactly 7 notes, and within the context of the tritone we can see why this is. Looking at the circle of fifths, we can see that a 7-note scale composed of fifths will create a semicircle with exactly 1 tritone. Having exactly 1 tritone means that the tritone functionality implied by the scale will more clearly designate a singular tonic chord as the center of harmonic gravity. Our minds can infer that if only the notes from C major have been played, then the tritone BF must point us towards a resolution into CE. Of course, musical practices are very often inclined towards defying expectations, and therefore there are common exceptions to every possible norm. But generally speaking, it is much easier to generate a sense of harmonious order from certainty and clarity than from ambiguity, and this is why the former tend to be standard norms and the latter tend to be exceptions. Within the theory of colors, Johann von Goethe remarks that the polarity of yellow and blue shares a phenomenological kinship with the polarity of major and minor within musical harmony. If we look at research regarding how human beings actually associate colors with musical forms, we find that this is in fact a general pattern within the human experience of music. Here we can begin to illustrate why exactly this is the case, and also to generalize Goethe's observation into much further reaching insights. We can begin by noticing that within the circle of fifths, a major third interval is found by moving 4 places clockwise. Again, we should notice the fundamental asymmetry here. We could also arrive at the same note by moving counterclockwise, but this would give us a minor 6 interval, which would appear to be an inversion of the major third due to the greater tension of the implied underlying harmony of the minor 6. The major third is more stable than the minor 6, and thus the major third carries an implication of clockwise motion through the circle. If we continue this pattern, we achieve an equilateral triangle, which corresponds to an augmented chord. Here we should note that the augmented chord is also immensely dissonant in a manner which parallels what we saw previously in the tritone. An augmented chord has a perfect symmetry which prevents us from interpreting the constituent notes within an implied harmonic hierarchy. If we then mirror this triadic formation, we derive a double augmented chord, which then constitutes the whole tone scale. The whole tone scale, much like the augmented chord and tritone, exhibits a symmetry, which thus generates a highly liminal morphology. The scale feels as though it is lost in a fog or dream. We next find the minor third by moving 3 places counterclockwise along the circle. Again, we have an asymmetry, now between the minor third and the inverted major 6 interval, and therefore a privileging of counterclockwise quartal motion. If we continue the pattern, we create a diminished 7th chord, which consists of minor third intervals as well as 2 tritone intervals. Here again, we have another highly symmetrical and thus immensely dissonant chord structure. So here we can begin to see that the polarity of major and minor is actually an expression of a much more encompassing polarity which cuts through the heart of all Western post-Pythagorean harmony. On the one hand, we have the affinity of perfect fifths, clockwise motion, major thirds, and triadic geometry. On the other, we have an affinity of perfect fourths, counterclockwise motion, minor thirds, and quadratic geometry. Those of you familiar with astrology will notice that this polarity of quartal and quintal relationships is identical to the polarity of hard and soft aspects. The soft aspects are the 120-degree trine, corresponding to the major third, and 60-degree sextile, corresponding to the whole tone. The hard aspects are the 180-degree opposition, corresponding to the tritone, and the 90-degree square, corresponding to the minor third. If we now begin to look at these principles of musical phenomenology within the context of the Astrochromagram, we can begin to see that the quintal-quartal harmonic polarity, the yellow-blue chromatic polarity, and the solar-lunar archetypal polarity are all in fact one and the same. The solar archetype is that of teleological trajectory. As Rudolf Steiner tells us, the Earth does not simply orbit the Sun, but rather follows the Sun through the cosmos. The Sun represents the principle of ultimate value, and the inner will which is drawn unto the realization of such value. The Moon, conversely, is that which reflects the Sun's radiance onto the world. It is the principle through which the solar will is given corporeal form through the processes of gestation and birth. Just as the sun directs us into the future, the moon directs us towards the past, through reflection and rumination. The polarity of the sun and moon is that of ascension and descension. Within a major chord, the ascending triadic major third lies beneath and thus encloses the minor third. This containment of the lunar within the solar is the principle of masculinity. Conversely, with the minor chord, we have the minor third serving as the ground of a major third. The lunar thus envelops the solar, thereby constellating archetypal femininity. The tritone can thus be seen as the feminine lunar principle at the height of its inner tension, a pregnancy which awaits the rebirth of the solar from within itself. With the augmented chord, conversely, we see the solar, masculine principle at the height of its alienation from the feminine, the wandering solar hero awaiting to be reintegrated through its union with the lunar goddess. In both instances, resolution occurs through the re-establishment of order through the recontextualizing of musical elements in relation to a center of harmonic gravity. If we begin with a solar form and extend it so as to form a 7-note scale, we generate the Lydian mode as a series of fifths which bridges between the solar and lunar domains. We can analyze different modes in terms of light and darkness, on the basis of relative sharps and flats, and among the diatonic modes, Lydian is the brightest, a fact which we see reflected here in the manner by which Lydian encompasses exclusively the upper, radiant archetypes and colors. As we add flats, we shift the scale counterclockwise, creating the slightly darker Ionian mode, or major scale. As we do so, we subtract an element of lunar blue and lean more heavily into Martian red, creating a scale which feels more active and energetic. Continuing this pattern, we then create the Mixolydian mode. Here we subtract more of the cerebral, ideational qualities of the mercurial in favor of the more corporeal, visceral qualities of Plutonic red. Mixolydian thus expresses a far more earthy, immanent phenomenological palette than either Lydian or Ionian. It's here that I need to make a slight correction from the last time I discussed this topic. In my previous analysis, I simply continued this pattern by maintaining the solar principle as the center of gravity while continuing into the minor modes. At that point, I was assuming that the solar principle could be regarded as the center of gravity by definition because I wasn't yet considering the affinity between minor harmonic forms and quadratic lunar principles and counterclockwise motion along the wheel. With those considerations at our disposal, however, we can now see that these solar renditions of the minor modes are in effect more like after images, while minor modes are more predominantly characterized by a lunar center of gravity. Beginning with the lunar archetype and moving in fourths, we generate the Locrian mode. Although the Locrian mode is by far the most unstable of the minor modes, it is also the brightest in the sense that it is the most characterized by the upper, radiant archetypes of the Astrochromagram. The lunar archetype is less stable as a center of gravity for the radiant tones, and if we look at the solar afterimage of the Locrian mode, we find the inverse situation. The solar archetype is likewise a less stable center of gravity in relation to predominantly abyssal tones. As we move Locrian clockwise, we first arrive at Phrygian. Phrygian has less flats relative to Locrian, and thus we might be tempted to regard it as brighter than Locrian. Here, however, we can see that such an analysis is somewhat misleading. The scale is phenomenologically darker and yet more stable. Within Locrian, the solar element is subordinated to the lunar, thus generating an immense tension which prevents the mode from ever feeling truly stabilized in relation to its own center of gravity. With Phrygian, however, the much more nocturnal and corporeal Jovian storm god is much more at home, creating a scale which is no longer inextricably unstable, but which nonetheless maintains a sense of mysterious liminality. Continuing this progression, we find the Aeolian mode, in which the vibrancy and vitality of the Venusian green is sacrificed in favor of the much more somber, stoic, and contractive power of the Saturnian. Completing this progression, we then finally arrive at Dorian. Dorian is particularly unique in that it perfectly bisects the solar and lunar halves of the wheel. Despite being a minor mode, we find that the primary lunar image and solar afterimage are of equal dominance, and in either case, we also find a perfect balance between the upper radiant elements and lower abyssal elements as well. Dorian is thus particularly versatile in that the symmetry it exhibits is a complementarity of light and darkness, masculine and feminine, as opposed to the symmetries exhibited by the diminished and augmented chords, within which the geometrical symmetry is in fact an expression of a sort of oversaturation of either masculine or feminine principles. Assuming that this is not abundantly clear already, I am not saying that individual notes correspond to specific archetypal elements or colors. We could take the circle of fifths and rotate it such that the associations correlate with completely different notes, of course. The chromatic and archetypal associations rather emerge from harmonic morphologies, which could be generated in any key with any given note serving as the root note. Regardless of our root note, however, the center of harmonic gravity will nonetheless exhibit either a solar or a lunar character, as those luminary archetypes are the fundamental anchors of compositionality. The exceptions to this are symmetrical scales which lack any defined center of gravity, such as the whole tone scale. There are exactly 2 whole tone scales, and due to the fundamentally liminal nature of the whole tone morphology, there is no phenomenological difference between them. This underlying symmetry and consequent ambiguity is of immense significance, as we can see this same pattern at work within the celestial realm. Of our 2 whole tone scales, we can see that one correlates with the luminaries and outer planets, while the other correlates with the inner planets as well as the principles of light and darkness, day and night. The physical body of our solar system can thus be seen as structured by the geometric interlocking of the 2 distinct whole tone scales. It is also immensely significant that although there are consistent patterns in the way that human beings experience the chromatic qualities of musical forms, there is nevertheless a great deal of variability. Each musical form is, in more ways than one, a hyperdimensional object, which can be disclosed in a plurality of different ways through symbiosis with human awareness. A person without musical training, for example, might hear both the Lydian mode and Ionian mode as a vague palette of red, yellow, and green, as their consciousness will primarily be detecting the fact that these modes are both major scales. For myself, I hear Lydian as much more blue than Ionian, as I associate the Lydian scale with a sharp 11 tone, which distinguishes it from Ionian. Ionian, on the other hand, I experience as much more yellow or beige. Someone else might experience Ionian as more red, especially if they associate the Ionian form more strongly with faster or more energetic kinds of music. When human beings experience music, we are not, contrary to popular belief, experiencing notes or frequencies. We rather experience tones, which are defined in relation to the musical morphologies within which the tones are contextualized. In order to experience music as music, in other words, we must necessarily be experiencing such an encompassing morphological pattern. As counterintuitive as this might seem, music is not sound, but rather music is that which we perceive through the sounds. The sounds are merely a vehicle intended to facilitate the experience of the musical orphenomen. If you've been following my channel for a bit, then you can probably see what I'm getting at here. The perception of musical form is, in fact, the very noetic insight which is being incorporated into the human ego through the emergence of the imaginal consciousness structure. Throughout the vast majority of human history, this faculty was one which operated in an almost entirely unconscious, bodily manner, but over the course of the past 500 years or so, this noetic faculty has been gradually becoming ever more integrated into the human sense of egoic self-agency. Looking at the history of Western music in particular, we can see that the gradual development of musical hyperdimensionality, which we see exemplified in jazz harmony, for example, has been a part of the very same process which resulted in Johann von Goethe's imaginal visions of the orphenomen of color. Musical forms consist of hyperdimensional objects because reality itself consists of such hyperdimensional objects, and our capacity to perceive such hyperdimensionality is our capacity to see through the sensory, physical world and into the underlying noetic contents of the world. So this is the part of the script where I was initially going to launch into an absolutely massive rant about the implicit epistemology within this manner of looking at sound and color, which was then going to bridge into a discussion of ontology and Rudolf Steiner and God knows what else along the way. But I decided to delete the first 3 paragraphs of that looming deluge and save a lot of that for a video specifically about epistemology. In any case, I've decided instead to end this video with something a bit more topical since you guys seem to like my intro so much. Thanks for watching.